Guys.
Loud and clear. Can't
Yep.
see you, but can hear you.
Okay, great. We'll start. Uh, and it's kickoff. Here we are. We have finally arrived to what we have all been anticipating, which is the AFCON 2023. And at least on our sides, on the sidelines, the individuals who stick into the sports business of Africa and the football business in particular, we are very, very excited to bring you the first ever edition of hashtag Business of AFCON, a collaboration between the Football Foundation for Africa and the Africa Business of Sport podcast. I'm so excited to be here with two individuals who I believe are one of the sharpest minds when it comes to the sport business in Africa, and very excited to be collaborating with a brand that I have always looked up to, and a brand that continues to be a shining light when it comes to transforming our game and football development within Africa. So let's start by introducing the co-hosts who are going to be with you throughout the next 5 weeks as we look into the business side of AFCON. First and foremost, let's start with my co-host, Adam Spiel, who I'm sure you know very well from the Africa Business of Sport podcast. Adam, great to have you here.
Great to have you here as well, Jabu. I'm excited for this series. Really just capturing and leading the conversation and everything AFCON as the tournament kicks off this month in a few days over the weekend.
And Brian Wasala, the founder and CEO of the Football Foundation for Africa. Brian, in episode 2 of the Africa Business of Sport podcast, you were there and our roads meet again. Great to have you. It's exciting to collaborate with the FFA for this Business of AFCON series. How are you doing and what are you looking forward to in the series?
I'm doing well, Jabu. Thank you very much for this collaboration. You know what it means to me. It's really a pleasure to share a platform with you guys. And I have to congratulate you, first of all, for the excellent work you've done with the Africa Business of Sport podcast. So looking forward to discuss really the behind the scenes of AFCON and what this means for the continent from an economic perspective. Pleasure to share the platform with you and Edem. Cheers.
Thank you so much, Brian. I think we might as well just go straight into it with our first segment of today's show slash episode, because in the first 15 minutes, we will be discussing amongst ourselves the tournament details, the participating teams of the AFCON 2023. And in the final 15 minutes of the show, we are going to be joined by Ndeye Diara Diaobaye, who is going to chat to us about the sponsorship and partnership landscape when it comes to the AFCON 2023. So maybe to just kick us off, Brian, there have been many changes with regards to the hosts of the AFCONs over the past couple of years. This AFCON was supposed to take place 6 months ago, but was pushed back due to the rainy season in West Africa. So there has been a whole lot of context behind where we find ourselves today. Could you just take us through how we found ourselves here and the anticipation that is headed to Ivory Coast with this AFCON 2023 kicking off in less than 2 days?
First of all, I think it's going to be an excellent AFCON. I think probably one of the best we'll ever witness, judging by the quality of football or players that we expect to see. We have also seen a lot of investments going into just building up momentum towards these tournaments. But some of the questions you raise are really crucial. For example, why we're having it in January, February instead of July, where it was moved. And we'll have to remind ourselves that AFCON was always a January tournament. And at some point, we had to shift in order to align with the global, or in this case, the European calendar of football. And this is a challenge we're still grappling with. I'm sure some of the players have not yet arrived. Onana will be coming in a day to their match. There were some questions about Kudus in the Ghana's camp because the European clubs have not released them. So there was this issue of how do we align with the global calendar to make sure that the employers of most of the people who will be playing at the AFCON are okay with the tournament and actually fully support it. Whether we should go in this direction or not is another question, which now leads into what we are discussing now. Why again are we in the January, February window? It's because of the weather. It was impossible to do this in July, June, because that's a rainy season in Ivory Coast, and in this case, I think it tells us that probably we should be organizing AFCON or African competitions independent to some extent to the global calendar to find the suitable timings for our competitions for us to maximize the social, cultural, and economic benefits of our football. Yeah.
AFCON 1984 was the last time. AFCON 1984 was the last time that Ivory Coast hosted the tournament, which is a very long time ago, and we find ourselves years and decades later in the present day 2023, where the AFCON has returned to Ivory Coast. We know that there has been substantial infrastructure development insofar as stadium development and renovations have been concerned, and this goes to show the commitment of Ivory Coast as a nation to deliver a world-class tournament. Now, before we go to Adam, Brian, I'd love to hear from your perspective, just how important is it that countries and host nations of AFCONs continue to be leading lights when it comes to using the opportunity to develop infrastructure and stadiums that will go on to be used way after the tournament has been completed?
I think when it comes to infrastructure, Jabu, this has always been a catch-22 situation for Africa. We need this infrastructure, but how can we make sure that they're sustainable and being used beyond these competitions? I think that's the question we have to ask ourselves. So a lot has to go into how we design these stadiums so that they're not just stadiums independent of where their situation. I think we saw this with one of the stadiums in South Africa, which is quite isolated and therefore very difficult to leverage this. So where we locate these stadiums and how we now plug them into the overall economic landscape of the cities, of the areas in which we build them, will be crucial going forward. And also their sizes, I think, will be very important. I am very impressed with the size of the stadiums in Ivory Coast. I think we have a 60,000, a 40,000, and the rest are 20,000 seater stadiums, which I think is a good mix. Because the challenge usually we have going forward is that our club football is not able to fit or to bring in as many people into these stadiums like we envision. So it will be only on a rare occasion that Ivory Coast will be able to fill a 40,000 or a 60,000 stadium. So what are we doing with this infrastructure? Can we, for example, repurpose these venues to be organizing other events, be it concerts, conferences? These are the kind of thinking that we need to get into when we are developing sports infrastructure in Africa. Jabu.
Adam, you recently appeared on CNN to speak about the economic impact of an AFCON going to a host nation within Africa. And one of the key components of that is, as Brian has said, stadium development and the development of infrastructure that will go on to be used way beyond the tournament's completion date. As Brian mentioned, the Alassane Ouattara Stadium, which will hold just up to 60,000 spectators, is one of the stadiums which were purpose-built for this tournament and was completed in October 2020. Adam, what is the significance when it comes to these stadiums that are constructed for AFCONs, and just how important is it for us to continue to bang on and emphasize that it is important for the long-term development of sports within Ivory Coast to have these stadiums that are sustainable firstly, but continue to attract different types of events, non-football events more particular?
For a very long time, we did see that Africa and African countries tend to struggle a lot when it comes to stadium maintenance culture. However, now we've seen with the growth of innovation within stadia development across the world, particularly in Qatar for the FIFA 2022 Men's World Cup, there's a new mentality where now stadia would not just be used for the senior national teams or main events, but will be accessible for even the younger national team, younger academies, and events that will be coming through. I mean, we know about the football business summit that FFA has every year. What's to say that FFA will not be able to have access to one of the stadia that will be used for the AFCON this year, where they'll be able to have conferences, able to have workshops, able to really go out there and change the narrative when it comes to development of sports here in Africa. In Europe, when you see the likes of Wembley Stadium, Etihad Stadium, Old Trafford, and the very big ones like the Santiago Bernabeu, they really activate their stadia beyond games because they know that, number one, tourism can be a very good aspect where who doesn't want to come and stand in the dressing room that Cristiano Ronaldo or Sergio Ramos once stood in? Who wouldn't want to see the trophies that are available there? So here in Africa, the good thing for us, and especially for the 6 stadiums that have been built, they will be able to find innovations where they can utilize them much more often and also bring some form of tourism around. Let's say best case scenario, Ivory Coast ends up winning the AFCON in one of those stadia. It will bring memories of enjoyment, memories of success, and memories of goodwill for the fans from Ivory Coast that will be trooping the stadium. So we are seeing a shift, and which is very exciting to see. Hopefully, other African countries replicate this shift so that we don't struggle with maintenance culture anymore.
Let's briefly discuss the participating teams before we move on to our special guest for this episode. Brian, if you listen to football commentary and experts or pundits, they all agree that all the teams that were supposed to, in inverted commas, the bigger teams that were, expected to reach AFCON have reached AFCON. And so clearly that might tend to favor a competition format and a maybe round of 16 knockout stage, which is more exciting because all the bigger African nations have been able to book their places for AFCON 2023. Could you just speak about the impact that might have on, TV ratings, the interest that individuals have in those tournaments, and who are the big teams that you are looking out for?
I think that's the exciting thing about this year's edition of the AFCON. We don't have any giants missing out, if you can put it that way. And right from the group stages, we have some very good matchups in terms of just the level of talent available in these teams, and that's what actually attracts the viewership. So we need to leverage on these to see how can we now package these and really market these as content so that even come next AFCON, this year there's been issues about media rights. That shouldn't be an issue next time around when it comes to AFCON. That said, I have to pick my favorites. I would say Morocco are coming in quite strongly, having finished third at the World Cup, so they must be favorites. And Nigeria also have a very strong squad, though in the midfield they're saying they're a bit not quite up to, but I still expect them to give a strong performance. I'll give Ivory Coast because they are the hosts, and also traditionally they have very good players, mostly playing their trade in Europe. And which brings me to an interesting fact. Like one of the questions that people have been grappling with is what percentage of players that will be at AFCON are actually based in the continent, or will a team predominantly made of talent from Africa or evenly between Africa and the rest of the world ever win an AFCON? And for me, that is what will start to signify the growth of football in Africa. If you understand where I am coming from. So yeah, I think it's going to be an exciting AFCON. Ivory Coast have also done well in terms of just giving it that African flavor, culture, and all this. We have been seeing what has been going on there. So really excited about what is coming up in the next 3 or 4 weeks.
Adam, I know that you are a big Liverpool and Mo Salah fan. So what do you think are the chances of the giants, as Brian says, such as Egypt, Morocco, Senegal, Nigeria? Or is this an AFCON where we see a huge upset and a smaller nation takes the trophy? So what are your thoughts on that? And just what is the significance of all the big nations being involved in this AFCON?
Hopefully, we do not see an upset, because I wouldn't want to watch a final which isn't as electric. Imagine an Egypt Nigeria final, or a Senegal Nigeria final, or an Egypt Ivory Coast final. Now that would really bring in all the numbers and people watching through. The beautiful thing about having all the top nations present is that the fans, the direct fans, which are the people who come from these nations, will be watching and pushing out content concerning their nation. And also fans of African football who may not necessarily come from any of the African countries, but have seen the excellence when it comes to African football, will be watching. And also the very third one, the likes of Sky Sports, being an international media, are starting, and even BBC, are starting to really grasp the hype and the excellence of African football. So if you have the big nations there, you can be rest assured that a lot of articles will be written by the likes of Live Score, The Athletic, Super Score, to really push out the African football agenda. For me, my heart and my mind and my support is behind Mohamed Salah and the Egyptians. They have won it a record-breaking 10 times, the only nation to do it 3 times in a row. And given the fact that Salah is really on heat this time, entering into this competition. And given the fact that Egypt went into the final last 2 years or last year, the last edition of the AFCON, I can be rest assured that supporting them this year, they have the highest chance of winning it. Of course, we always use the statistics when it comes to the previous winners. So they have the highest chance. Secondly, I'll pick Morocco just because of the excellence that they showed to us African fans and global fans of football at the 2022 Men's World Cup. And my third pick, I think I have to go with Algeria. I know a lot of people aren't necessarily picking Algeria as the winners, but I mean, for a country that took it in 2019, you can't really take it away from them that the likes of Mahrez and his brothers, who really look silent, can go in there and do something very dangerous. But for me, Salah and his boys should really bring it home so that we can beat the gong about the agenda for an African winning the next Ballon d'Or.
Nope, that's good to hear. Sounds good. And if, with my opinion, for what it's worth, I would say that Ghana is a dark horse when it comes to the AFCON, because I really believe in Kudus, Chris Hughton. It's going to be very interesting to see an ex-Premier League manager being involved in the AFCON. So I definitely do think there is space here for a huge upset. Now, let's move on to our next segment of this first edition of the hashtag Business of AFCON, and we are bringing on a sports business and media specialist within the African sport business. We are very, very excited to have for a couple of minutes the thoughts of the founder of 1931 and hashtag Africa Scores, as well as the newly announced new co-host of the Africa Business of Sport podcast going forward. We are very, very excited to have you, Ndeye Diarra Diabaye. Welcome on, Ndeye. How are you doing?
Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay? All right. You forgot to mention, Jabu, that I'm also an African champion as a fellow Senegalese. And I am appalled that among the three of you, nobody said that Senegal could be a potential contender. I mean, we are, after all, the African champion, are we not? Did you guys forget? Okay, so I'm glad you guys brought the female voice of reason to bring you back to reality and to remind you that as African champions, we have something to lose. And so therefore, we will be defending our title fiercely throughout this AFCON 2023. But very excited to be with you guys, and thank you so much for your insights to start. I love what Brian said when he opened his remark and said that, you know, as a reminder, this was the time of year that AFCON used to take place. We only moved it for the convenience of international football. And I'm going to dive straight into the concept and, you know, the trends around sponsoring, but we're seeing a strong interest from commercial partners. And so that is also showing the world that our competition matters, that the competitions of Africa matter, and we can no longer let ourselves be dictated by international football agenda. So, yeah, very, very excited to be here and talk about it with you guys today. And to support Senegal, because apparently none of you guys are going to do so. So, yeah.
Well, you know, it's like that. We can always support the past winners, but what we can support is excellence when it comes to partnering with national teams. We see that in Europe, a lot of the top national teams have some of the very biggest brands coming in to partner with them. Let's take your home country, Senegal, for example. Since you guys winning the AFCON, how has it benefited you from a national team point of view? Sponsorship wise, have new brands come to say that we love the fact that Sadio Mane and his boys really did us proud, so want to partner and really send the level to a different level?
Mm-hmm. So I think when it comes to adding new sponsors, we definitely have added new sponsors. The overall, when you look at what's been interesting is when you look at the different teams contributing to AFCON, participating in AFCON this year, you have a majority of teams that are sponsored first by local companies and then by international companies, meaning that you have a few teams, Senegal included, Cameroon, of course, as well, Cote d'Ivoire, that are sponsored by the same international sponsors that you see at AFCON. So I'm talking Orange, I'm talking 1xBet and whatnot, Puma for some of them, but you also have a strong sense of also local companies and also public institutions that are supporting our teams this year. And I think it's exciting. Unfortunately, we don't have the full picture. I think sometimes in December, we had 7 teams that came out and presented their different rosters. So out of this 7 rosters, we had 57 companies in total being announced, with the majority, like I said, of local companies, which is a good sign. But we need to push. And, you know, I think this year, despite the broadcasting rights saga, as I call it, the fact that this year the competition is going to be covering 180 territories is definitely an opportunity for our local brands to try and find new ways to present themselves and to sponsor and to partner with our teams. Yeah.
That's interesting, and like just to pick up on that in terms of local brands really investing in our football, because we look at CAF's roster of sponsors, and many of them have bought into just 2 years with this AFCON and probably Morocco. So what can we probably change to get our big brands that are indigenous to the continent to sponsor competition like AFCON, but also get into that long-term relationship with this property or CAF to see to it that there is mutual gains, like there's gain on the business side, there's gain on the sporting side, for us to achieve the kind of exponential growth we are yearning for in Africa.
Thank you, Brian, for your question. I think just like you, I'm going to take us back a couple of years earlier in history. 20 years ago, MTN actually signed what at the time was the biggest sponsoring deal in African sports history. They had signed a 4-year deal for $12.5 million. So it sounded big at the time. It's not as big anymore today, obviously, but it was the biggest deal. So, MTN, obviously being a South African telco giant, had already opened the gates for, that African local sponsor ownership of our competitions. And we can indeed only hope that we get finally back to the point of having longer term deals. I think what has been missing for the competition to get this type of sponsor, especially for local sponsors, is visibility. We're all very much aware of let's call it the logistical issues and in the implementation of the tournament. There's been a lot of uncertainty around dates that has impacted the tournament in a lot of ways, whether it's broadcasting rights, media partnerships. I mean, we're at the 11th hour of the AFCON and we're still getting news of sponsors being signed and broadcasting rights being completed. So I think we currently are seeing CAF setting processes the way it wasn't set up before. So my hope is that every lesson that needs to be learned for this AFCON in Ivory Coast is learned, and that we definitely calibrate ourselves and get ourselves ready for AFCON in Morocco. Morocco is, I used to live in Morocco up until a couple of days ago. Morocco has a very strong local private sector. The private sector in Morocco is going to be welcoming AFCON with opening arms. So I think it's just all about setting precedents year on year in terms of setting up best practices to ensure that our sponsors can really understand the added value of giving their money and sharing their brand to AFCON. So it means ensuring that we have more broadcasting rights ready before we go talk to the sponsors, ensuring that we've got visibility as to where are the next AFCONs going to happen, ensuring that we're also showing that we have the right infrastructures and we have the connections as well with the audience. One thing that I'm very excited, one thing I'm very excited to see is how do we leapfrog, from the TV football consumption to a mobile consumption. We know that Africa is leapfrogging in so many ways when you look at fintech. I'm looking forward to seeing new technologies emerge where we find ways to appeal to sponsors to actually help us produce and broadcast football on mobile to indeed access a larger amount of fans. So yeah.
If we look at the different kit manufacturers and sportswear brands who are going to be taking their places on different spaces on the t-shirts of many of the teams who are going to be participating in this AFCON, Puma is one of the more significant ones who are going to be very visible, not only because I think they have quite a lot
a sponsorship. They have a sponsorship with CAF, and they also are, I think, covering 4 to 5 teams. Yeah.
Exactly. That's exactly what I wanted to get to. So just how big of an activation opportunity is this for Puma going into their first competition as a CAF partner, but of most of the teams, not most of the teams, but rather the largest percentage of other sponsors of teams who are going to be kit manufacturers at the AFCON 2023?
I'm glad you asked. I think, it's going to be very interesting to observe how Puma acts because, it's always, when you're looking at the African continent as an international brand, you always want to see how others fare before you advance yourself, right? And I think Puma is taking risks in the sense that they are the manufacturer that is sponsoring and supporting the largest amount of teams. They're also the lead sponsor, manufacturing sponsor for AFCON. So I think it shows that they're all bullish about Africa and African football. I think it's going to be interesting to see whether or not they're able to share with us some numbers in terms of how many kids they have sold. There is that misconception that Africa for manufacturing is impossible to penetrate as a market because of because of counterfeiting, because of the prices being too high for the population. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing some numbers really, both behind how much kits has Puma sold in Ivory Coast, but also in every countries that Puma has been representing like national teams, and also perhaps even looking at I'm sure we'll have those, but looking at internationally how many jerseys were sold for the different teams. I think that will definitely be interesting. I did want to highlight one thing. So there's Puma and Umbro that are the two international sponsors that have the most teams around the AFCON this year. In total, we have 18 brands, which shows you that there is indeed a market, and that some brands are more bullish than others. But there's also an African brand, actually. I found out this while doing my research, but Burkina Faso has its own manufacturer, and it's a Burkina Faso owned and domiciliated manufacturer. They're called Tovio, and I think this is one case, and actually they've been around for a while now. They've been around since the 90s. But I think I'm looking forward to the day where we also have local manufacturers sponsoring our own teams, and we're not just waiting for big brands to come and tell us that yes, our teams are worthy of getting sponsorship. We have a tremendous opportunity, I think, to look at the intersection of fashion and sports on the continent. The same way you're seeing right now in the US, you have this I forget his name, but this player of the Cleveland Browns in the NFL who's always coming up with very high-end African fashion whenever he's doing his walk around. I think we should definitely take that momentum and take that moment. There are a few brands that I know of, such as Neofar by Mokos from Senegal, that is doing a special activation around AFCON. He does shoes. But I think it's definitely something worth looking. And I feel like if international brands want to tap into the local African markets, they shouldn't shy away from partnering with local fashion brands as well.
I mean, 100% for me, what I particularly like about Puma being a part of CAF and African football is that they are the first brand taking a leap of faith with Africa, knowing very well that they already have an established global following. And the truth of the matter is now the generation of African players that we're seeing are just so, exciting to watch and so raw in terms of the number of activations that they can do with them. Some of the stars would see on display in a few days and throughout the month of January and February will not have necessarily have boot deals or partnership with Puma. Now Puma can come in there and have activations with them and really push out the African agenda. And while doing that, we would find that more young people, both from the diaspora and from Africa, would want to purchase goods and services that are representing the African brand. So, for instance, if Puma comes in and does a form of partnership with a player like Osimhen, or maybe a player like Salah, or maybe a player like Mohamed Kudus, I would want to go and buy a Kudus, specially designed boots that has his name on it, as compared to having representation for other, international stars who are not African. So the good thing is that Puma is taking advantage of potential activations going forward. They do actually have to be bullish for it to become successful. It's one thing to create the balls and have a cup store, but it's another thing to go in there, have activations with these players, get to know their stories, push out their agenda when it comes to storytelling and why they chose a brand, and really just continue to envelope themselves. It can also be part of technical workshops for coaches, for officials who are part of national teams and moving forward. So there's so much to learn and see forward with the brand. And hopefully, as you mentioned, African brands can learn from this and start to push forward with what they believe can be excellence within sports business.
I feel that I'm just going to jump on what Adam said. I think you've mentioned activation, and that's interesting to me because I do think that in and as much as we've been bringing a lot of new sponsors this year, and I think Africa Sports Unified, and shout out to them because they did a tremendous work with their report. I think they noted that CAF had signed 12 new sponsors for AFCON this year. I still think we can do better, guys, in terms of activation with the sponsors, though. I still think that we're still at a very simple stage, I would say, of sponsoring, where the sponsors just put their logos on the stadium, or they do some displaying in the streets and whatnot. But I really think we should push the activation further, indeed, to learn more about what do the African fans actually want out of their football experience. And I feel like we need to, beyond just chasing for more sponsors and bigger sponsorship amount, we also need to find more sponsors that are willing and able to activate and to engage with the fans in a completely innovative and different way.
Yeah, I think just to plug on to that, I think it's a very interesting dynamic here because sponsors are usually looking for return on investment, so they're looking for customers within this space. And one of the challenges we've had in Africa is that we do not have strong economies, and I think that's why sponsors are not making a heavy investment in football or sports in general. If the model continues to be tied on visibility. And probably I think we'll address this a bit later. It's one of the reasons why SuperSport was saying, no, it's okay. We can do without the AFCON, because with the Premier League or the foreign competitions, they are especially targeting betting companies, which are more willing to invest their money knowing the socio-economic situation in Africa. So how do we get these other industries, these other the telcos, the FMCGs, to sponsor, but with a very long-term mindset, and that is pegged on the economic development of Africa. I think this will be something interesting, or something that we should work towards as a continent.
I mean, I think the economic development cannot go without sports, right? So I think, it's in and as much as, our economies are still in a developing stage. All the, like I said, 20 years ago, actually before MTN, Nokia was the sponsor of AFCON. So international brands have always had an interest in Africa. It's just a matter, I think, right now for us as African, both African individuals and economies and businesses, to tell them, hey, we want more than just money. If you want to share, to put your brand next to our number one competition, we want, partners that do more than simply sign a check and then put a logo somewhere. I think it's also about that. It's how do we ourselves become more demanding of our sponsors? So that they can also see the added value, because of course for them right now, if it's just to put a logo somewhere, the ROI is not going to be, actually, first of all, it's going to be hard to calculate, but it's also not going to be very tangible. Versus if you tell them okay, give me a portion of money for this, and then let's activate, let's do a program, let's develop stadiums, let's do grassroots development. There are so many things I think we can invent and think of in terms of sponsoring and partnering with the private sector companies at the local and international level. We just have to be the ones, I think, to push those boundaries and to have those expectations for ourselves.
That was the founder of 1931, #Africa Scores, Ndeye Diarra Diobaye, giving us an exceptional insight into the sponsorship and commercial partnership landscape when it comes to the AFCON 2023. Ndeye, thank you so much for joining us.
You're most welcome.
Pleasure to have you.
You forgot to say that I was an African champion.
Once again, I clearly have an agenda against Senegal. Yeah, African champion.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, guys. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
That brings an end to the first edition of our #Business of AFCON series in collaboration with the Football Foundation for Africa. We are going to be here every single Thursday, where we speak about different facets of the AFCON and bringing on different guests who also have insightful things to say about what is going to be an exciting competition. So thank you so much for joining us for this episode. Looking forward to have you on the next one. Africa Business of Sport podcast. You can find us on Twitter at Africa BSP, on Instagram at Africa Business of Sport, and on LinkedIn, Africa Business of Sport podcast. Please follow the Football Foundation for Africa on X. They are the FF Africa, and you can find them on Twitter and LinkedIn as well at the Africa Business of Sport podcast. Thank you so much for joining us on this first episode. We will see you very soon. Cheers for now. Now transitioning to our audience Q&A. If you have any questions, we're just going to be around for 1 or 2 minutes to take one of the questions that you have. So please, if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat for Ndeye, Brian, or Adam.
I think the first question this one had to come. The debacle of broadcasting rights between MultiChoice, SuperSport, and CAF. What can be done to avoid future occurrences? I don't know who wants to take this. Probably there you can continue on that, or and Edem, feel free.
I'm looking for the question. Where is it? Oh, sorry, I found it. Okay.
Okay. And there you go, then I'll talk.
Is it the question about the future occurrences of the debacle of broadcasting rights? Yep.
Let me just repeat it for you there. If you want to, the debacle of broadcasting rights between MultiChoice Supersport and CAF, what can be done to avoid future occurrences? And if I can add on, how does that impact the sponsorship going into the tournament? Because sponsors might be expecting a certain number of viewers who are going to be watching the AFCON, and where we have MultiChoice Supersport saying they won't broadcast AFCON, which they did a U-turn on. How does that impact the sponsorship landscape of the tournament too? Be fascinated to hear that.
Well, I mean, I'm not, unfortunately, I'm not a little fly on the wall in the CAF's negotiation, but I think it's always difficult to come to a sponsor and tell them, hey, give me X amount of money when I can't really show them, like, who is going to broadcast their brand and what population is going to see their brand, right? So I think that pretty much answers your question, Jabu. It's extremely difficult to negotiate a sponsorship agreement when you don't necessarily have your broadcasting partner announced. That's number one. And number two, I think to avoid the debacle, definitely one word: anticipation. We have, the next AFCON is already announced. We already know where it's going to be happening. It's going to be happening in Morocco. Let's start this conversation as soon as AFCON in Ivory Coast is over. Let's avoid ourselves the embarrassment of having another, 1 week before the tournament that all the broadcasting partners are announced. It's I think we're not doing ourselves a service by having this sort of like late in the game, attitude towards broadcasting rights and broadcasting partners. And I'm sure the CAF teams are doing their best. I'm not saying the contrary, but at the end of the day, it is the public image of African football, African business, and Africa in general that is being damaged by those broadcasting rights saga. So hopefully they can, all get in a room and agree on what will everything look like in the next round.
And would you agree with me?
I think to play the devil's advocate here, Supersports probably gave that initial announcement as a way of tilting the table towards their favor, perhaps. So this is all speculation, because we know that they would have to go get the sub-license rights from New World TV, and maybe New World TV was being a tad bit difficult. They'll go out there, announce that, guys, we can't do this. Then we'll see the huge backlash from people, and the Supersport to go back in there and tell, New World TV, can you see that X million people will be pissed that if there is no AFCON coming through because we just have the resources. So now we've asked you for X amount. Maybe we're going to add 3 values to it, so X plus 3. So give us this now. Then New World TV would have to bend their hand and then do as Supersports please. That can be one scenario. Another scenario can be that Supersports eventually got the rights from IMG. We do know that IMG is the one to give the licensing rights to the rest of the world, and that will be an English commentary. So perhaps Supersports got it from IMG after Sky Sports had announced, and they got it at a much lesser value. So for the brand itself, sometimes it's good to have a disruptive press, because it enables you to have a bigger bargaining power. But of course, as you said in there, for 2025, everything has to be sorted. You don't want CAF announcing a month or 2 months before the event the brand that is going to give or that is going to get all the licensing rights. Those things have to be prepared in advance. And I'm very sure Supersports, being Canal Plus, New World TV, and all the other brands would prepare in advance, get everything paid and settled, and start their activations weeks and months in advance before the next tournament.
And that is the first edition. Thank you so much for joining this Q&A. We do have one more question, actually, just to wrap up this first edition, and we should be out. I want to first thank you all. My question is, how can we make a strong connection between Africa football businesses' social impact and startup social impact that are not in the sport field? Brian, do you want to take this from a more social development point of view? How can football and the football business in the context of AFCON be more impactful in this way?
I think the question here is about leveraging, for example, as a host nation, how do you leverage hosting of the AFCON for long-term benefits? I think that's the question here. And these really requires planning, a lot of strategy from the different stakeholders. right from the bidding process, I think countries should start to understand what it is that we want to achieve by hosting an AFCON or any other competition for that matter, and plan towards, being able to leverage the competition. So what does this mean for social investment? It's, for example, the amount of revenues that are gained. In what projects do we foresee them going into? The businesses that have been kind of catalyzed because of hosting the AFCON, how are we able to sustain these long term? Right now, there's a very strong startup ecosystem in Africa. How do you connect these to the football space? I think these are some of the things that we need to really plan, strategize, enable for us to really get long-term value from organizing these competitions.
That's definitely a question worth asking. Thank you so much for joining us again on this first edition of the hashtag Business of AFCON. For those who stuck around for the Q&A, hopefully next time you're
Jabu, could I just come in just quickly? I saw that there were two questions that I wanted to address. One of them is somebody asked the total prize money, and the total prize money is at $21 million this year, which makes AFCON it makes AFCON's prize money go higher than the Asia Cup. That's number one. And then someone asked which special brands had I seen as partners this year. It's true that TikTok hasn't returned, but I do think we should pay attention to the Ivorian private sector and how much it mobilized itself for AFCON this year. Those were my final words. Thank you so much, guys, for having me.
No, really appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time there. Thank you to all our listeners and viewers. We will see you next week, Thursday, for the next edition of the hashtag Business of AFCON, a collaboration between the Football Foundation for Africa and the Africa Business of Sport podcast. See you next week.